Steve Skelton. I work for the Government of Jersey, and I look after the sort of the long-term policy challenges that the island faces, so issues of climate and energy and transport and island planning and things like that. I'm here with my colleagues who have helped prepare these policies, and the purpose is just to help, just to explain them really, and take any questions along the way. We're a reasonably light audience, so we might have a little bit more time for discussion as we go through. There's quite a bit in the briefing materials, so I won't wait until the end because you'll probably have forgotten the point at which you're going to ask the question, so just stick your hand up and jump in. We've got a microphone so that everyone can hear. We're covering two policies today that were both requested halfway through last year for production by the end of the year, so hence why they're sort of packaged together. They do have quite a lot of overlap between the two issues. So the carbon neutral strategy, you'll recall that there was a vote in May last year which declared a climate emergency, and Assembly members asked for a plan which aims to be carbon neutral by 2030 to be produced by the end of 2019. So that's what we've produced. It hasn't been agreed yet, and the ambition to actually become carbon neutral by 2030 hasn't been agreed. It's not an adopted policy yet. They're still looking at the plan to understand how you might do that. We've asked States Assembly members to do three things when they consider this plan, which we think will be on the 25th of February. We've asked them to have a look at the principles that we've put in place, which we think define carbon neutrality. We've asked them to explicitly agree to the establishment of a Citizens Assembly, and we've also asked them to request a final plan back by the end of this year, 2020, which will incorporate all that work into sort of an action plan for the future. And we're going to talk you through these issues in the briefing today. We just start with a graphic which shows data from the Jersey Met Office since 1894, and the colours represent the sort of the relative increases in temperature year on year. And as you can see, as we get towards the present day, those hotter years come more frequently, and that's similar to what we see around the world. And this is part of a program called Climate Stripes, where each Met Office is kind of showing its local version of how global warming is affecting its area. And obviously, it's a global phenomenon, so we see this pattern replicated in other jurisdictions. The carbon neutral strategy doesn't sort of rehearse and reopen the question of whether we believe in climate change. That issue was sort of settled in the States Assembly in 2014 when they adopted the energy plan, Pathway 2050. So we build this strategy on top of the existing Pathway 2050, and we accept that decision that Jersey is a signatory to global climate conventions and it already has plans in place to address these issues. This graph shows our on-island emissions from 1990 to the present day and projections beyond. And I'll talk a little bit as I go forward about different types of emissions. This is what we call Scope 1 emissions, and this is what each country, each territory is responsible for addressing as part of the Kyoto Convention, so the Kyoto Protocol. So for a number of years now, we've captured with data about our Scope 1 emissions. We've been able to understand it, and that's been audited on our behalf by a third party. The dark green line shows where we've come from. So we've had a reduction in on-island emissions over the last 30 years. This large reduction here is a result of swaps, switching out on-island electricity generation for the importation of low-carbon electricity from the European grid. And you can see that we need a couple of steps of similar significance if we were to get towards zero. The other two lines show the trajectory we would expect if we didn't apply the policies that were agreed 5 years ago. And the lower line shows the trajectory we would expect to see if we do apply the policies that were agreed 5 years ago. So this isn't a reflection of where we get to under the new strategy, it's a reflection of what we expect under the existing strategy. And it shows that there are already policies in the pipeline that we've been rolling out year on year, commitments that were made in that energy plan to help sort of move the vehicle fleet forward, to address home installation and heating, etc. That we need to do just to achieve what we already set out for. So to achieve more, we need to plan and do more. The line here just suggests 2030 as a date and shows that you'd have around about 280, I think it's from memory, 1,000 tonnes of carbon emissions annually that we need to address in this plan. So in some ways, there's a gap that needs to be closed, and that's what the State Assembly have asked us to look at. The first thing we wanted to do in the strategy, in discussions with ministers and with you here today, is just to clarify that we're talking about the blue box, which is a net zero position. So the island will still produce carbon emissions, but they will be offset and mitigated through other steps, and that those things will balance each other out. We're not talking about just offsetting, we're not talking about just sort of buying our way out of this. The important thing it says there is that we have ambitious annual reductions in carbon emissions, more ambitious than currently they would need to be, but there is a remaining amount of emissions which we offset, and they might be things from particularly significant local industries, or emissions associated with flights, either flights for business pleasure or on occasion life-saving flights to UK hospitals or other things. So there are sort of forms of emissions that we'll still expect to have. The question is, which will they be, and how will we manage the offsetting of those? We're not talking about the green box, which is that there will be no emissions. That's not the policy of any jurisdiction, and would effectively bring society to a halt on the day that we sort of moved to that position. As I said before, we've accounted for our on-island emissions for a number of years. They're published in arrears based on local data that we provide. So if anybody is interested to explore our scope 1 emissions, that data set is available on the Government Jersey Open Data platform, and you can have a look at it yourself. I'm now going to explain the three different scopes that the strategy talks about. So scope 1 emissions are the direct on-island emissions that I've talked about already, that we're responsible for under our international agreements and obligations. They come from effectively fuels that we burn on the island, so the fuel in your car, the fuel in your heating system, but equally from things like agriculture, which produces methane, and from things like energy from waste, electricity generation, air travel. That's air travel actually where they take on fuel on the island. And that breaks down to a large portion of our emissions coming from transport. So that's about 30% of the overall total coming from road transport, and the rest from marine and air. And these blobs here, residential and business, relate primarily to heating. So residential heating, business buildings like this, your home, your workplace. We have some other contributors, a small contribution from agriculture, a small contribution from waste, and a small contribution from energy generation in general. Most of our energy, as we said, is, in fact, we'll talk about that next, so I'll leave that. And then you can see down here that the way we use our land has a net effect. It can take carbon out of the atmosphere, and so that's something that we need to think about as well. So the second scope of emissions that we talk about are those which are generated in the production of the energy and the electricity that we consume. So this is quite low for Jersey. You may be aware that our energy contract with EDF provides for 2/3 of that to be sourced from nuclear generation and 1/3 of that to be sourced from the Rance barrage, which is a renewable source. So that's a low carbon source of energy. So our scope 2 emissions are small, but they are directly our responsibility. They come from energy that we generate. So if we were in a different jurisdiction, we created our own energy and managed our own grid, then they would be a direct issue for us. And you'll see as we move forward how the strategy proposes to address the different scope of emissions. And then the third scope is essentially everything that indirectly we are accountable for that happens off island. So this is carbon emissions from the production, transfer, movement, disposal of goods and services that we consume. So, as it says there, things like the greenhouse gases produced in creating your phone, or the marine diesel burnt in bringing fruits and vegetables that you choose to buy in the supermarket into our island, international aviation, things like that. As we move into the principles, I'll explain why we need to enumerate these things, because we talk about them in slightly different ways. as a kind of a Western economy, our global footprint is quite significant. We're small, but we're high consumers in comparison to less developed parts of the world. And so how we think about our impact on the world relates in large part to how we think about our Scope 3 emissions. In simple terms, when we look at our Scope 1 emissions, our sort of international legal obligations, most of our current sort of challenges relate to the personal choices that people make. So how you choose to travel, how you choose to heat your home or invest in insulation or wear a jumper or other things. You know, what role you play in your business to encourage sustainable sort of business practices, that sort of thing. I think we're conscious that government has a role in supporting people to make different choices, but it has to be in conjunction with people. So if we compare this, for example, with the public health challenges, where we each eat what we eat and we exercise as much as we exercise, government can do things around the pricing of alcohol, the pricing of cigarettes, but actually it's down to many of us to actually choose to want to live in a healthy way. This is a similar situation. There's work required on both sides. So the strategy sets out 4 principles, and this is one of the things we're asking the States Assembly to discuss and hopefully agree in the coming weeks. The first principle, which would be a shift in our policy from the current energy plan, is that we should have a strategic focus on all emissions. So our current energy plan addresses on-island emissions from those fuel sources we talked about before only, and we're saying that actually government should consider all types of emissions. And this would open the door to thinking about government policies and government use of public resources to encourage people to live more lightly, consume differently, recycle, buy more local. That's not really a sort of a policy angle, if you like, that we use at the moment. But crucially, in respect of the request for a definition or a plan for carbon neutrality, Principle 2 says that our carbon neutral definition should only extend to Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So what this means is, what will we count and how will we know when we've got to a net zero position? Well, we'll count those on-island emissions and emissions from electricity generation associated with Jersey, but we wouldn't count that wider global impact. Now that's a position slightly beyond what we're obliged to take. So if you look at something like the UK's commitment to carbon neutral, net neutral by 2050, they're just talking about Scope 1. We're saying, ministers are saying that particularly because our transition would look like, in large part, the electrification of many of our operations, we don't really seek to outsource that responsibility somewhere else. We should hold that within our definition. So going slightly beyond what we're kind of obliged to do, but still holding a reasonable target. The challenge with including Scope 3 is in large part one of enumeration, so we don't know what that global footprint looks like. We don't know when you fly, when you leave the island, we don't know how much of certain products have been brought, and we're not in control of the means of production and distribution associated with those products, so we can't affect change in those directly. But as by Principle 1, we may be taking a greater interest in encouraging people to buy and consume and live differently. So it's a kind of a step forward, not considering all of it in our net neutral definition. The third principle is about that net position. So we're saying that it's appropriate to use carbon offsetting. All jurisdictions are looking to use carbon offsetting. That should only be done alongside ambitious emissions reduction policies. So this isn't just about saying, well, we can stand still and buy our way out of this problem. It's saying, actually, we need to make progress, but there's a residual amount that we need to offset. And if we're going to do that, as a responsible and ambitious jurisdiction, we should do that to the highest recognised standards. So there's quite a bit of work to do for us in government as an island to become more experts in in this market, decide where we want to stand in that supply chain. Do we want to work with our sort of international partners, with Jersey-based businesses and organisations that have an international reach and footprint to try and look at offset generation, find projects, run projects, sponsor projects, or do we simply want to be a consumer that just goes to the market and buys a product? And if you look in the strategy, there are a series of graphs that show where we think that market will go based on sort of best intelligence from other industry players, and it essentially shows that the cost of offsetting will increase. particularly as the big players move towards their targets of, say, 2050 for the UK, 2045 for Scotland. There will be demand increase for the cost of for offsets, and we think the price will rise. So in terms of where Jersey pitches itself, there are competing tensions. So if we try to become carbon neutral faster, there will be technology costs, because we think technology costs broadly are coming down. Electric cars will get cheaper, electric boilers will get more affordable, but there are competing costs in that if we arrive late, the offset market will be paying more. So part of the timing question, the question of timing is really important in this. And finally, the fourth principle is, as it says there, that we need to own this challenge as a whole island. That it's not just the responsibility of government or just the responsibility of residents of islanders. It needs to be a collaborative approach, both in determining what we should be seeking to achieve and then determining how we should seek to achieve it. So in that context, the main strategic choice we have made is that we should take the time to try and co-produce our way towards a future plan. As I say, that's both in what the plan's ambition should be and how we should seek to make that progress. And so much of what the strategy talks about relates to this and provides information that can support this conversation. So you'll have heard a discussion about Citizens' Assembly, and that's a key part of it, but we think that sits in a wider process, which starts with everybody on the island, hopefully thinking about, talking about, and getting involved in suggesting ideas that we might take up, and then feeding that through into that process of the Citizens' Assembly, which will recommend a way forward, recommend a level of ambition, and recommend how we become carbon neutral. So that's our kind of general question that we want to ask, is how should we do this? And in particular, in thinking about how we should do it, we need to think about the trade-offs of different scenarios, of doing this faster, doing it slower, who wins, who loses, and how do we seek to mitigate some of that. And also, even if we can come to a conclusion about our net position, we're interested in what happens after that. So is there a point at which we have a zero carbon transport fleet, even if we get to a net position sooner? So we'd like some thoughts on that. That's likely to take place in the early summer and hopefully conclude before the summer holidays. And then we've got a big job of work to pick that up and kind of respond to it. So government has committed that the report of the Citizens' Assembly will be made public, it will be debated in the Assembly chamber, and the government will make a line-by-line response saying whether it does or doesn't accept the recommendations that have been made. They'll then be written into that long-term action plan that we need to bring forward by the end of the year, along with, I think, hopefully, some of the kind of more grassroots plans that we see emerging. So we're conscious that a number of parishes have declared a climate emergency and action plans are forming there. We're hoping to sort of encourage and facilitate businesses to come forward with, ambitious plans also for youth groups at schools to make sure their voice is heard, and then to sort of consolidate that into a shared plan for the future, which we accept will take a long time to implement. There's a lot in there, so that will be changes to the tax system, some of that will be changes to other policy measures, but some of that will be hopefully initiatives coming forward that help people travel more sustainably, help people recycle products, or kind of get involved in tree planting or whatever in their local community. On the Citizens' Assembly in particular, we're talking about a minimum of about 50 people. They will be randomly selected through a several-stage random process and weighted in proportion to age, gender, ethnicity and other factors, so that they reflect the Jersey population. And they'll be brought together with independent facilitators to discuss over a number of weekends expert inputs, local input from government, from scientists, from businesses, from local people, from young people, and they will be asked to kind of consider all that. And the key bit they play in the decision-making process is to make a recommendation. So we talked a bit in the previous session about how does that relate to the States Assembly role. So the States Assembly would commission this, but they crucially remain the decision maker. They have the power as elected representatives to decide and to agree what actually happens. The Citizens' Assembly's role is to say, we think you should trial this, based on the input from across the island. The last point in this presentation is just to reflect again on the sort of the timescales of this. So we had a strong vote in the States Assembly last year. It was 40-1 in favour of declaring a climate emergency in terms of asking for this plan. There's a lot of conversation about environmental matters at the moment. It's high on the agenda. That doesn't always remain the case. Other factors come through. The economy moves in a cycle. We have peaks and troughs, and there are times when it's harder to talk strategically about the environment. So what we think we have now is a window of opportunity to build the foundations for a long-term change. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways we describe that, is that that's important and difficult because traditionally we haven't counted the costs, or we haven't had to pay the costs of kind of carbon pollution. So if you're a high polluting business, or if you drive a big car, you know, that doesn't cost you, other than marginally in sort of fuel duty, a lot more than others, despite the fact that the environmental impact of those choices are borne by the rest of the world. And we think that in the future, as technologies move through, as we see the realisation of kind of decentralised energy generation, actually we should find that costs reduce. So it's quite expensive to extract fossil fuels and refine them and move them around and distribute them and all that sort of stuff. That's not as efficient a process as you might be able to achieve in the future to produce and use and store energy. So the future should see a reduction in costs. But the big challenge that we've faced for a long time now is that to get from here to there is a big hump. It costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of effort, and it changes people's circumstances and standing very significantly. And you know, governments of all countries have struggled to make that transition, and it means, you know, reinvesting in our plant, in our cars, in our heating systems, reskilling our workforce, reusing land. It requires people to make those choices and accept that to pay our way through in a just fashion, we need some sharing of the cost, and that's very much about current generations paying forward for the benefit of future generations. So many of us will live through this transition, but might not necessarily see it all the way through. Other people will come through in the future and won't have the chance to pay their way forward, which is why it's an intergenerational thing. It's a very interesting question. You know, the voice of young people, the voice of older people, they sit in different places on this trajectory. And I think what we're trying to do in the island-wide conversation, the Citizen Assembly, in the creation of a climate emergency fund to ring fence and protect the money that it might cost to do this, is create foundations that will last as we move through the 20s, move through the 30s, you know, and other political currents and other sort of issues come to bear on our priorities. If we want to make this shift, we need to decide and then stick to it. So I think that is the end of that briefing.